Welcome to the moving chaos. You are currently standing on a box. I have more boxes to pack, more boxes behind me. We brought stuff up from the cellar. Welcome to Narrative. My name is Veronica and I'm in the middle of moving. Could you tell? Today I want to talk to you about this thing that I've noticed more often this year than any before. It does not mean that it hasn't happened more often before. I'm noticing this year. And that is that American authors are trying to be anything but just American. And it is bothering the shit out of me. What made me want to talk about this is this whole recent shenanigan by Colby Wilkins, who claimed to be Native American because someone 5 generations or so ago was maybe Native Americans. And it's so confusing. Just someone who is from like Sweden in Europe, hearing that kind of like lineage kind of focus, it's kind of like, what? Weird. And also claiming that you are Native American when clearly you're not. But Colby Wilkins is definitely not the only one who has been doing this. I think this year alone we've had the person that called themselves Kimchi, that was an like American that pretended to be Korean and literally used the name Kimchi. Like, Jesus. And then we had, what's her name? Taylor Barden, that has allegedly created multiple pen names with different things, that someone was Native American, someone was Latinx. Like, it's a whole vibe, apparently, to just fake your heritage. This topic is based like an intersection between American authors and white Americans. So we're talking about this intersection where white American authors are trying desperately to be anything other than just a white American author. And this isn't limited just to authors. It's something that I've noticed that Americans at large do, which is very weird because you have this country, America, that is claiming to always be number one and the best in the world. But then you have the people being so horny to be defining themselves by anything other than just American. Italian American, Dutch American, Irish American, etc. Calling yourself American is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. What becomes weird is when you try to claim a cultural identity that isn't something that you have had actual contact with. If your family came to America 100 years ago and you haven't been back since, you can't claim to be, for example, Italian, because you don't have an understanding for what it's like. You don't understand what the culture is like or the people. And especially if it's like, oh, I had a relative on my mother's side 5 generations ago that was born in Sicily. You're not an Italian because of that. Like, that's not an actual connection. You do know that, right? Just for example, my grandfather that I have grown up with is born and raised in Italy. I have spent more summers in Italy than I can count. I was learning Italian in elementary school. I have a lot of exposure to the culture, like the Italian culture, but I would still never call myself an Italian because I am culturally Swedish, because this is where I was born and raised, not in Italy. I have heritage from Italy, but I am Swedish. All you know is entertainment's view of that culture, and maybe word of mouth stories that is passed down through your story, or whatever observations you've been able to make as an outsider. Because inherently that's what we are. We are outsiders of a culture we were not born and raised in. I have a very close relationship to Italy, but I am still an outsider because I wasn't born and raised there. I don't live there now. I don't have that immersion. But even if I moved to Italy now, I would still only be observing a culture whose nuances I cannot necessarily grasp. We have to be able to acknowledge this reality and, to the best of our ability, mitigate the potential damage that we can inflict on a culture or a community if we choose to write these types of stories. Bottom line is that there is nothing wrong with being just American. You don't need to spice it up. Of course, there's no one reason for why this is happening, and it's not actually limited to just America. You can see this across the world. It's just America is very loud. It's very much like pushed in the forefront of everyone. One of the reasons why I think this thing happens specifically in America is that America has kind of branded themselves as this number one, the best, whoo, kind of thing. But despite that, it is a lot of, like, it has core aspects that makes it very, very homogenous. And one of the key aspects is this blind patriotism. Like the whole thing with allegiance to the flag, it's just like, what? It's so weird, man. Okay, it's so fucking weird. Like, an American friend of mine told me about that whole flag thing, and like, I'm like, what the actual fuck? Anyway. Anyway, because of the blind patriotism and other aspects of American culture that kind of makes the whole thing very homogenous, it's very difficult in such a large country to stand out. If you're not the top of the cheerleading squad, if you're not the top of the football squad, or you're not the president of the school, or you are not the CEO, or I don't fucking know, the best, the top, the number one, right? You graduate, whatever, top of your class, person who makes the speech, I can't remember what it's called right now. That sets you apart because everyone else doesn't get mentioned. If you're not the best, you don't get mentioned. There's nothing about you that sets you apart, that stands out. I also think this is the reason for why we see a lot of identity issues coming out of the US, specifically with this aggressive kind of adherence to one thing. If you're a Swiftie, that's all you are. If you're a BTS person, that's all you are. Like, you're one thing because that is a defining factor of who you are. It's not just you enjoy Taylor Swift's music. Like, I enjoy some of Taylor Swift's music. I'm not a Swiftie because I don't identify, my identity is not tied to this one thing. But because of a country that perpetuates this, you have to be number one, you have to be one thing and be the best at it, perpetuating that mentality, you can see that reflected in this behavior as well. So if you're the biggest fan, that's what sets you apart, that's what gives you value, and that's what gives you meaning, instead of, you know, having a balanced take on life. Anyway, I went off on a tangent. What I was trying to say is that there's this need to identify yourself with something that sets you apart. Because people who exist in a culture that defines itself on being number one will inevitably fail. Because you can only have one number one and it's always finite. So inevitably you are going to fail. And I think in a culture that praises and values number one being the best, will experience failing much more harshly. That there will be a harsher impact on you than if you were, you know, average in Sweden. It's a whole joke in there. Långa landet lagom, you know, joke for the Scandinavians. And it all just boils down to this. If you're not number one, you're a failure. If you don't stand out, you don't exist. Or it's because they think that they are entitled to certain protections if they belong to this one group. That there is protection in being part of this group. Which of course isn't, you know, how it works in practice. And in actuality, doing this could make the people that actually belong to this group furious because you're potentially damaging all their work in breaking down stereotypes or assumptions about this group. A lot of the times we see the people who do this, specifically authors in this case, who do this thing, they also tend to write the types of stories that fetishizes this exotic behavior or this exotic culture because they are just regurgitating stereotypes and harmful rhetoric around them. There's a sense of pandering to the fetishization that is taking place. And people are aware that that is a bad thing. However, if I am part of the group that is being fetishized, then I have protection from this criticism. Wow, I'm struggling with words today. Blah. Essentially, by claiming to be part of this group, they perceive themselves to having the permission or being safe from criticism when they are just feeding into stereotypes and harmful rhetoric. This behavior is really weird. Like, just plain and simple, absolutely weird. I really don't think that you have to only write your own experience. I really don't. But if you do step outside of your own experience, and specifically the type of stories that deal with those experiences, because I think that if you're writing let's say a Black woman as the main character in your high fantasy world, you're not writing about the Black woman experience. So I don't necessarily think that all stories are treated equal in this case, but there are ways to mitigate the risks that you're taking when you're stepping outside of that and trying to write those types of stories. And it is your responsibility to make sure that you have proper beta readers, you have sensitivity readers, that you are very conscious about what you're doing. And I think a lot of people struggle with that aspect, unfortunately, because I don't think that all stories are treated equal. I don't think that the same advice goes for every story. I think that you need to be aware of your own skill, your intention, the audience that you're trying to write to. This behavior is just fucking weird, so please stop it. You're fine. You can write what you want without having to attach your identity to something, a culture that isn't yours. It's fine, okay? And with that said, thank you very much for watching. I hope that you had a good time. If you did, make sure to hit subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! And of course, don't forget that you can support me over on Patreon and get access to all of my stories.